Our next speaker is Robert Riley II. Mr. Riley was released from incarceration in federal prison in May of 2008. After years of substance misuse and incarceration, he was able to sustain sobriety by seeking help through a 12-step program. In 2012, Robert met Chad Sabora while detoxing a heroin user at her home. They went on to form the STL Heroin Help, a nonprofit aimed at providing resources to heroin users. Robert and Chad have gone on to form the Missouri Network for Opiate Reform and Recovery, another nonprofit organization that provides education in local high schools, legislative advocacy, and other community involvement battling the opiate epidemic. Robert has been labeled a recovery activist by addiction counselors throughout Missouri and continues to be a part of the solution to the opiate epidemic gripping the country. Robert and Chad wrote and advocated passage of all of the naloxone distribution laws for the state of Missouri. They have gone on to write and successfully advocate for 911 Good Samaritan legislation and several other pieces of important criminal justice reform legislation. Robert is credentialed as a certified reciprocal alcohol and drug counselor and is employed as an addiction counselor at Clayton Behavioral. He owns and operates 5 recovery supportive houses in St. Louis.
Talked about everything already. My name's Robert, and I'm a person in long-term recovery. And what that means to me is I haven't found it necessary to use drugs or alcohol since September 6th of 2006. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. I'm not from Missouri. I was born and raised in Orange County, California. I was raised by a single mom. My father went to prison when I was 2.5. He's a heroin user. My dad's currently 71 years old, released from incarceration. He hasn't been back, but he's living homeless currently in Las Vegas, Nevada, actively using drugs. And that's okay. That's his choice. I've offered him options. He's refused them. I still love him. I was in Vegas about a month ago. Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook invited 50 recovery advocates from across the country to do this thing called Mobilize Recovery. And I was invited, and while I was there, I got to have lunch with my dad, and it was a great day. It was sad to see him, but it was great to see him like that, but it was great to see my dad and be able to buy him lunch. My mom is never really, I was telling somebody earlier, my mom's like a 2 glass of wine a year type drinker, and she usually gets drunk off that first glass because she's like 5 foot tall. You know, no substance use issues. I was raised, she was, you know, it was just her and I for a long time. She raised me with good morals, good upbringing, taught me right from wrong, beat me when I needed it. No, I'm just kidding. She did, though. And my mom struggled with mental health throughout her life. You know, she sought help, got help. I found drugs and alcohol when I was 14. And I'm not going to go through my whole life story because I want to touch on some of what's going on in Missouri and tell you what I'm doing today, because this is about hope, right? That's what you told me? All right. So my story is this. I drank whiskey for the first time when I was 14. Within 1 week's time, I had smoked some weed, I had done some cocaine, and I was on my way to Compton, California to buy some PCP with some older guys. Drugs made me feel good. Why do people use drugs and alcohol? Because they work. That's why they use them, because they work. Drugs and alcohol were never my problem. Drugs and alcohol were my solution. The problem is that I was using a high-risk solution that caused me incarceration, the loss of friends, the loss of relationships, the loss of family, for my mom to cry herself to sleep every night I was incarcerated. and the nights she didn't know where I was. And that's a high-risk solution. And it took me a long time to figure that out. I was released, you heard me say my sobriety date is September 6th of 2006. I was released May 14th, 2008, and that's when I came to St. Louis because my mom lives in the St. Louis region, and that's where the feds put me. And I had 20 months of sobriety. And that came about because of three things that happened in August of 2006. One is my little cousin was shot and murdered over a drug deal. He was 21 years old. He thought I was the best thing. I thought he was the best thing. But he was living that lifestyle, and it cost him his life, and he was a great kid. The second thing that happened was I received a letter from my son, Aaron Riley, and it started out, "Dear Robert, stop writing us, stop calling us, stop saying you're our dad. Dads are there for birthdays and hockey games, and you've never been there for any of that stuff. So we just don't want to hear from you anymore." And the third thing that happened is I was walking the track with this old school cat on this federal penitentiary, and I was telling him about my dad. I was telling him about my little cousin. I was telling him about me. I was telling him about this letter from my son. And he said, "Come out here tomorrow, I want to show you something." And I came out the next day, and he handed me a piece of paper, and it was his time computation sheet. And next to release date, it said, "Deceased." He said, "Check it out. If you don't change everything right now, this is what you're going to end up with." See, in the feds, a life sentence, it's called truth in sentencing. It's a life sentence. If you get 50 years in the feds, you're about to go do about 48 and a half of them. It's not like the state system. And those had a profound impact on me. So I came to St. Louis. Literally, the only thing I owned were the clothes that my mom mailed down to the federal prison I was in. Rode the bus up here, did 6 months in the federal halfway house, stayed sober, got a job at a printing company, met a girl who was going to be a social worker. She started writing papers about my life. I wanted to know what the hell she was writing about me. We started talking. She said, "Maybe you should go to college." I applied for a scholarship for this organization that gives scholarships to people in recovery. I went to college. I got a job at Clayton Behavioral. I met Chad Sabora. We started helping people who were using drugs. We started handing out naloxone on the streets of St. Louis in 2012. Everybody said, "You're enabling." We said, "The only thing we're enabling is breathing." And then Chad, my best friend, who you mentioned, is a former prosecuting attorney who became a heroin user. That's how we wrote the laws. And so we wrote the 9/11 Good Samaritan law. It took us 6 years to get it passed. But in the meantime, we wrote the naloxone laws that we now have in the state of Missouri, and we got those passed. I went to Steve Stinger, the former St. Louis County executive, who I knew his nephew had died of an accidental drug poisoning. He got the prescription drug monitoring program started for us, and now we have about 78% of the state covered. We do run a needle exchange program in St. Louis with the blessing of the mayor, the city prosecutor, Kim Gardner, and the chief of police, because it does reduce, it's a public health crisis that we have. It does save lives. It's not, listen, we all practice harm reduction, right? How many of you drove here tonight, right? How many of you wore your seatbelt? Harm reduction, right? When we passed the seatbelt laws, it didn't make people start doing 150 down the highway, right? No, it was just to keep you safe. Should you decide to do over 100 miles an hour, right? Or experience an accidental drug poisoning, because they are accidental. Very few overdoses are on purpose. That kid that lied in that basement his mother is a dear friend of mine. That's why we wrote the 9/11, because we didn't want to have to talk to another mother. I'm a harm reductionist. I practice harm reduction. I've been to the White House 3 times. I stood behind the governor when he signed the naloxone laws into law. I was with the governor the day he signed, former Governor Greitens. Why do we have so many former politicians here? Former Governor Greitens when he signed SB 501, which also made it against the law for judges to tell people they had to go off their medications. A lot of judges around the state were doing that, telling them you couldn't be on Suboxone, you couldn't be on this, you couldn't be on that. And today, I own 5 sober houses. I just opened up a brand new world-class treatment facility not too far from here in Dittmer, Missouri, called Sauna Lake Recovery Center. I interviewed a psychiatrist this morning for a job. By the way, did I tell you guys I have 14 felony convictions? I'm considered a violent offender. The director of the Department of Mental Health gave me a recommendation letter last week so I could adopt my little sister-in-law. My wife lost her mother about 3 weeks ago, and I was actually able to get it, but I can't vote. But I can do all these things. There's hope. Is there any hope yet? Is there any hope? I'm a convicted felon. I got a job. Don't tell me you can't go get a job if you have felonies. I own my own company. I have 70 people working out at Sauna Lake for me right now. Don't tell me you can't do anything. Who was it that asked me earlier, said, what happened? And I said, the pastor. And I said, I took some actions and my life changed. That's what I did. I plugged into the recovery community. So we can shame and stigmatize, and we can keep showing people locked up and walking away in handcuffs, and we can talk about the parents that overdose with the baby in the back seat, or we can start humanizing this. These are people that are suffering, and they're part of our community. And I've spoken in this community. I've spoke at the local high school, not this one, but I spoke at other local high schools and junior highs and at the college up here. And I have the same message. Like, my story is great. I'm the exception in a lot of ways, but not more than the mother who is pregnant, used drugs until she gave birth, had to go through the court system to get that child back that was born addicted to drugs, got the child back, and never used drugs again. Her story is far more powerful than mine. My son, my oldest son, not the one that wrote the letter, but my older son, works for me at Sauna Lake. We do recover. I get to come out here and talk with a DEA agent, public health worker, a judge, a doctor, and another person that works in this field with me. How blessed am I? I do recover. Thanks for letting me share.